Hi everybody, this is Hüseyin Alptekin, your instructor for Nationalism and Ethnicity class. From now on we will have our classes in this fashion. They will be online classes. And hopefully we will have interactive classes starting from next week. But for now, I want to start with this video lecture so that at least we will feel a little bit normal before the weekend. At least we will feel, life is somewhat going on. We can have our classes, both you and I, because I think we all need this. And I really hope you are all well, you are all safe. I hope you are following the instructions, staying calm and, washing your hands and, putting some social distance from other people and washing your hands again and again and again. These are all really important things. I am following those instructions and I urge you to do the same. And I know this is really tough because you must be missing your friends, even the school, even your classes, you must be missing them. And some of you might be even staying in the dormitory right now, especially our international students. If you didn't have a chance to go back to your home countries, maybe you are now in your dormitory room and wondering how long this will last. We all are actually. We all are wondering how long this will last. But right now, there's nothing much to do other than just following the instructions. Anyway, so let's get back to class. Yes, we will have our classes from now on in this way, with these video lectures, and next week I think we will be able to do some interactive classes using Adobe Connect. But for now, as I told you right before, I want to have a start with this little YouTube lecture video. And we will have our classes for this one and the future ones from here. This is where I live. This is my apartment. And actually this is my kitchen. This is the part of the apartment. I left my wife and my daughter, Merve and Zeynep. I left them in a village home. I thought that would be safer for them and healthier for them and less stressful. I won't tell you where they are now. Even Corona doesn't know that. So since I'm alone in my apartment, it turned out that just the kitchen is enough for me as a living space. And probably many of you are also using very small portions of your apartments. I guess this is what makes to people when they study for too long. But anyway, so today we will have our class. We will have our lecture today. But first I want to deal with some logistical matters. A couple remarks perhaps on where we are now and where we are heading to from here. So, we have covered a number of issues so far. We talked about ethnicity, nationalism, we talked about origins of nations and nationalism, some conceptual, some historical, some theoretical discussions we made. Then we had a discussion on banal nationalism that was the week before the racism week. And the last lecture we had was racism. That was a short while ago. But since in those days the virus was already out and people were worried and the school was about to be closed for a while, so in our last class only 1/3 of you guys came to the class. And today I want to just a little bit summarize that week, because many of you missed that discussion. And also I have, I guess, the good news for you guys. Before the midterm, I'm not thinking of covering new topics. So we were actually about to discuss populism and nationalism in contemporary world. And we were also scheduled to discuss international relations and nationalism. But I think for the midterm, which we will have next week, by the way, in a take-home fashion, before the midterm, I don't think we are ready to deal with new topics. So today, what we will do is, I want to summarize the Racism Week with you guys and maybe throw out a couple questions. And I also want to talk about the movie that I assigned you to watch last week. The movie was called The Birth of a Nation. So this is what we will do today. And from now on, after the midterm, probably I will need to change the syllabus accordingly. And probably we will have some revisions on the assignments. But first, let's see how it goes. I don't want to do it now. I don't want to hurry too much for it. We will have time to think about it. So right now, just we will pack it up and just summarize Racism Week. And next week we will have a take-home midterm exam, and I will send you an email, a message about the details of the exam. But now let's keep it light and let's have just a class, a lecture on racism, what we talked in our last meeting day. In our last meeting day, we discussed racism in a number of ways. But our conclusion was there are 3 steps to racism. And the first one was, the first step of racism is actually a belief. It's not exactly knowledge, but it's a belief, let's call it. It's a belief on the existence of distinct races. So what I mean with that is, the very first step of racism requires sort of understanding, which is a misunderstanding, by the way, on the existence of internally homogeneous and mutually exclusive racial groups. So we believe that there are certain races in the world, they are distinct from each other, and internally they are homogeneous. So this was pretty much the science of the 19th century. Back in those days, even the scientists falsely believed that there are a number of races in the world, and they thought that was an objective being, that was objectively given. And they called those races mostly with colors. Obviously there was the white race, the Europeans and North Americans. There was the black race, Africans, or the immigrants coming from Africa. And they also called the third race as the yellow race, as the Asians. And with Asian I mean Far Asia, Far East, the Chinese, Koreans, the Japanese, etc. And they also, again falsely, categorized the fourth race as the red race, which would be the Native Americans, the Aborigines of Australia, the Inuits of today's Canada, let's call it, and this kind of native populations. And we might even include some local remnants of the people, the natives of South America and Central America, which is pretty much wiped out now. They are either mixed with the European settlers or just killed by massacres or by different kinds of illnesses carried out from Europe. And a very small population of those natives came to today. But anyway, these 4 groups were called mutually exclusive and sort of collectively exhaustive and internally homogeneous racial groups. That was the science, that was the human biology of the 19th century. Today we know that is wrong. Today we know that all the racial groups, they are actually not internally homogeneous. We are all mixed. And now we can examine the human DNA, and it looks like, it turns out that we all have a common origin. So there is a common origin for humans, no matter what color their skin is. Yes, this science has changed. Now we have different scientific feedback, scientific findings. But nevertheless, the idea of races did not go away. So still, many of us believe that there are objectively given racial groups which are mutually exclusive and internally homogeneous. So that's the first stage of racism. So this kind of cognition, let's call it, this kind of misunderstanding. But we can debate whether it's enough to make you a racist, just to believe that there are different races. Probably not. But that's a necessary step for a full-scale racism. The second step of racism tells us that the races are not only distinct and different, but they are different in the way that we can line them up in a hierarchy. So they are hierarchically ordered. There are superior races and there are inferior races. There are better ones and there are the worse ones. So with this way, in fact, we are constructing an order of races. The higher ones and the lower ones. That is the second step of racism. And the third step of racism is, it takes even more than that. In the third step of racism, people who follow this ideology or belief, let's call it, believe that the superior races have the right to dominate the lower ones, and in certain cases to exterminate them, like we saw in a number of cases throughout history, most famously in Holocaust, when the Nazi Germany was trying to wipe out the Jewish people of Germany and Europe, actually, together with some other ethnic groups or races. So these are the three steps of racism. There are different races, some of them are better than others, and the better races have the right, or sometimes the duty, the mission, to dominate the lower ones. And these three dangerous beliefs constructed the racism, both the old day racism and the modern time racism. And we might also take this kind of racism from a different glance, perhaps. So, there is the motivation to wipe out different races, and there is the behavior. So, the act of wiping out the races. And there is also a cognitive background even before that, the idea that there are different races. So, this would not be this much dangerous if it was just, I don't know, just a highly sophisticated, no matter how wrong it is, a highly sophisticated idea. But this behavioral part made it even more dangerous. It's because we saw a long period of history in which the people who believed that they belonged to a certain race discriminated against other races in order to dominate them. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Sometimes individually, sometimes at the group level, and sometimes with the state's support. And from here, from this conceptual discussion, I want to remind you the movie that I assigned you to watch. It is not a new movie. It dates back to 1915, and the name of the movie is The Birth of a Nation. And that movie was made by David Griffith, and it is a movie on the racism, of course. By the way, there's something going on with my computer. Sorry, I need to fix this. Okay, so it's an old movie, produced and directed by David Griffith. I guess that was normal in those times. People used to direct the movies, produce them, and sometimes even act in them. That was pretty much the norm, I believe. And that movie shows us an alternative history, almost like a parallel universe, in which the black people, the African Americans, are the ones who oppress the white race. And by the way, this movie is not on racism. This movie is a racist movie, because it's not just depicting how racism was implemented in the US. It's not like, I don't know, American History X. It's not a movie to show us the true face of racism. It is a movie to tell a story, a racist story, to the audience. And that story tells us that the blacks were the oppressors of American history. I believe many of you had the chance to watch it. If you have not, please watch it, because we will also be responsible for the movie in our midterm. It's very long, it's about 3 hours long, and might be a little bit boring because it's 1915, so it's a silent movie, it's silent cinema. You just see some title cards, some very brief descriptions of the story, of the plot, but other than that, there is little bit inside. It's mostly about acting and no sound, no talking, no dialogue. The very first half of the movie is more about the Civil War in the United States from 1861 to 65, the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. And you don't see much about race. There is, but not as much as you would see in the second half, in the latter half of the movie. The latter half of the movie is about the Reconstruction era. It's the post-Civil War era, in which you see the racist message to be really visible, very disturbing. And the movie tells us that the white men, they have the right to rule the United States, and the black people were just happily serving the white men as slaves. But those, evil northerners, they just, abused this sensitive cleavage in the United States and just, provoked the Civil War. And in the war, we see that the black people, the African Americans, and the movie calls them Negroes, which is a very racist term today. You shouldn't use that. But the movie in the title cards call them Negroes. The African Americans, they are the oppressors in the movie. They harm people, and they have a thirst for power, and they abuse this power. And it even shows that in the elections right after the war in southern states, and I think the movie is in South Carolina, in the southern states, the black people do not allow the white to vote, and in fact they vote sometimes more than once, and the black people vote more than once in the movie. And also in the title cards, it tells us that the white people have the right to defend themselves. And actually I want to read you some title cards. I put them here. So let's say in one of them it says that the helpless white minority. That is the title card in the movie. And another one even goes really extreme, and it depicts the racist organization, the supremacist organization, Ku Klux Klan, as a savior, as a good thing. And I'm just reading it from the title card. It says, "The Ku Klux Klan, the organization that saved the South from the anarchy of black rule, but not without the shedding of more blood than at Gettysburg." And this is another incident. And it's really disturbing in many ways. There is even a remark from Woodrow Wilson, the famous liberal American president, Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson, speaking now, says that the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the southern country. And the movie, it talks about the Aryan race, it talks about the Negroes, it talks about the rights of the white man against the black oppression. So it's pretty much 100% racist movie. But there are two troubling things about the movie. It's not just an old movie that we should forget about. One thing is, it was a good movie in terms of its technical background. So it's one of the cornerstones of American cinema. And probably in the cinema schools The movie is still being taught to students, independent of its content perhaps. But even more importantly, the movie tells us how the normal changes over time. So that was normal to call African Americans Negro. That was normal for the white man to think that it has a natural right to rule, and the mission for the black is to serve to his or her white masters. And that was so normal. And when the African Americans, they rose to power, the movie gets offended from that. It shows that, the black got everything and there's nothing left for the white, which we know is not right, because I will tell you a little bit about what happened after those years as well. So that was normal in 1915. It's not too long ago. It is, 60 years after the Civil War ended. So that is 50 years after the Civil War ended. So that's not too old for us. This is the time when we talk about the liberal world order, Woodrow Wilson, all those, rights of the nations. But even in the 20th century, we came up with this. So it's no surprise that when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, he could use very similar racist rhetoric, but not only rhetoric, not only discrimination and suppression, but a quite monstrous level of extermination. But that ideology, racism ideology, was pretty much similar that you saw in the movie and what followed afterwards in Germany and many other parts of the world. So, what happened after this time? Actually, yes, the blacks, they had the right to vote in the United States, but many rights of the blacks were limited. Probably you heard about Jim Crow laws, and those laws limited the black people's right to vote. And there were certain restrictions. Some of them were about the poll tax. So it was more like a head tax. You needed to pay to vote. It would be about your tax payment procedure. Some of them were about literacy. They thought that, if you will vote, then you need to be conscious and, educated person. And for that, you need to be able to read and write. So they carried out some literacy tests over the people. And as you can imagine, both in terms of tax issue and literacy test, the blacks were quite disadvantaged. They couldn't pay poll tax, and in a quite disproportionate way compared to the whites, they were unable to read. But also some states even implemented some grandparent regulations. So if your grandparents couldn't vote, then you had no right to vote in that state. So these were all the different ways mostly the southern states came up with to restrict the black vote. But it's not just about political participation. Also in social life. There were many ways the blacks were discriminated against. In hotels, in the restaurants, even I know when they wanted to wash their hands, they had to use different taps. They couldn't use the same place to wash their hands with white people. And there were some signs pretty much everywhere on the seats in the public transportation vehicles, on the buses, in the restaurants. Whites only and the colored only. Such a kind of distinction. And all these restrictions continued up until 1960s. If you remember the 60s, these were the hot times, hot years, in terms of the Vietnam War, in terms of the Kennedy assassination, many things going on in the world. It was the heydays of the Cold War, very tense. In Turkey too, we also had tense years in the 60s with the rise of radical right, and even before that with the bloody coup d'etat of Turkey in 1960. So very tough years pretty much everywhere. The Algerian independence war, continued decolonization around the world, lots of things, bad things going on. In the United States, up until the 60s, those restrictions, both in terms of political participation and civil rights, continued. Up until John F. Kennedy era. When Kennedy became president, he started to eradicate such restrictions. Actually, it even started with Eisenhower. I would say that started with Eisenhower. But in terms of legalization, in terms of legal changes, Kennedy was the main carrier. But he was murdered. He was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, replaced him. And with Lyndon Johnson, we saw the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in '64 and '65. And since then, in terms of legal regulations, African Americans have the equal rights. Yet, still, there is a big problem going on in the American society. Still, 1 of every 3 adult male African American has been convicted, has been to prison sometime in his or her past or at present, just serving the sentence in the prisons. And they are still uneducated compared to the white people, undereducated, let's call it this way. They are underdeveloped in terms of their financial resources. They have, as a result of this situation, education and income variables, they have very, very, bad circumstances in terms of healthcare. And unfortunately, when such discrimination becomes pretty much settled, embedded in the political institutions, but also in the social institutions, what we see is the criminalization of a certain community. And after so many years, so many decades of exclusion and discrimination, and with the lack of access to vertical mobilization in the society in terms of income and in terms of education, African Americans, it's no surprise that they are more associated with drug dealing. They are more associated with street violence. And the family is really loose. Family is also pretty much weak in African Americans compared to the Caucasians, let's say the WASP, and especially compared to the Latinos of the United States. So even today in 2020, what we see in the United States is a racial hierarchy. Not in the sense that some races are superior to others, not that stuff, but in terms of the empirical situation. The blacks of the United States have fewer resources and fewer opportunities to compete with their white or other racial or other communal competitors, let's call it. So it's pretty much the case right now. And we know that as a fact because the United States Census Bureau, they collect data on different racial identities and ethnic identities. They ask people whether you are African American or Asian American or Caucasian. They have this kind of categories. You just pick one of them. So your self-identification makes you Caucasian or African American or Asian American. So this is the case in the United States. But racism is not the problem of the United States alone. Anywhere you see races, and by races here I mean not biologically distinct groups, but social groups. Because yes, biologically the races don't exist. We are all mixed, we said that. We are all Homo sapiens in other words. But socially there are real races. Socially it matters. Because socially we group people, we categorize people into racial groups. So it doesn't matter what the biology tells us. What matters more is, our stereotypes, how we group people. And we do. We group people into distinct racial groups. And, that's the first stage of racism. And we pretty much internalize that. Pretty much everybody. We think about races, the blacks, the whites, we don't say perhaps the yellow race or the red race anymore, but we think about the Asians or the natives. But for whites and blacks, we still use the color. And that's pretty much the trend in the entire world, not just here I'm talking about. So now, that's the situation with races in the United States, and this discrimination and oppression, especially against African Americans, not exclusively, because Asians and of course Native Americans were also suffered from racism, but because of Hollywood perhaps, and because of their population, because of this slavery history, we are mostly familiar with the black history. But the rest of the world is not free from racism, we said. And here I want to just throw you a question. The question also you can see on the syllabus. What about Turkey? Is racism relevant in Turkey? Is it something we should consider? Is it something we should be concerned with? Some people say there is no racism in Turkey because there are no races in Turkey. We are all the same. That being said, from now on we see also Africans in Turkey, African immigrants, and we associate them with selling watches in the streets, on the streets, and we find them sympathetic, we find them harmless. But do you think we build some kind of hierarchy between us, because we are the Caucasians here, we are the white people here, between us and African immigrants? So that's a question to think about. Yes, many of the people I see around, my students, my friends, they are good people. They don't have this racist background in their minds, but sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes, hopefully not in your immediate environment, but sometimes very consciously, racism might be a problem here too. We might think about a hierarchy, a virtual hierarchy between us as the white man and them. So that's a question to think about. And I want you to think about, any cases where you can find, we are actually, consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly, are we hurting African Americans in Turkey? Africans in Turkey, are we hurting them? Because we have a growing number of refugees. We might call them refugees. Not legally, but they are coming here because of economic hardships. So I think the economic refugee might be an appropriate term here. Not legally, but more socially, let's call it. So that's one question to think about. Another question to think about here is, when we talk about race, does it have to be just about the white versus the black? So can we also extend the question to different ethnic groups or national identities? Right now we have a big number of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Again, the refugee here is not the legal proper concept. Legally they are not refugees here because Turkey has not signed the convention based on this. Turkey doesn't call the immigrants coming from its eastern territories, its eastern neighbors, as refugees. They are pretty much the guests, that's the legal term for it. But politically they came here from the war, they escaped from the war, so they are actually political refugees in that sense. And can we think about the Arab race? I mean, biologically I already answered that. There is no race like that. There are no races at all. But do you think the same things going on in different parts of the world, between different social groups, between different races, do you think it's also valid and relevant in Turkey too? Do you feel like a sense of racism against especially Syrians in Turkey? So my first question was about the African people living and working in Turkey. My second question is about Syrians in Turkey. And the third question, this concept, is that the concept of racism, is it also valid for the discriminations, for the beliefs of that hierarchy of superior and inferior ones, do you think it's also valid for our own ethnic groups here? Turks, Kurds, or different ethnic groups, Armenians living in Turkey. Also, we have slight minorities like the Jewish community in Turkey, or the Orthodox Greek community in Turkey. And we have, Turkey is quite a mixture of different ethnic backgrounds. So do you think this conceptual tool of racism is also valid for the relations between different ethnic groups in Turkey? So what I want you to think about such relations between us, the citizens of this country, and the people coming from Africa here. And with Africa, what I mean is mostly the sub-Saharan Africa, the black Africa, the dark Africa. Secondly, between us, the citizens of Turkey, and Syrian refugees here. And thirdly, between the citizens of Turkey, Turks, Kurds, or the non-Muslim minorities, or different ethnic backgrounds. Do you observe or do you feel some sort of racism embedded in the political institutions or embedded in the social norms and social practices? So please think about that, because if you remember earlier I told you that in the exam I will not ask you questions about what is race, or what did this author tell us about that. I don't want you to memorize things. Of course you should know the concepts, but not in terms of memorizing them. Just get the content of them, have a sense of them. But what I want you to do in the exam is more about applying such concepts to our everyday practice, to our ordinary life, to what we are experiencing here in Turkey. So these are the questions to think about. And my last question for the day is more up to date, actually. So this coronavirus, the COVID-19, the most recent update of the coronavirus that we are suffering from nowadays globally, it also brought up some questions about racism. Some people, like American President Trump, calls it the Chinese virus, not even Wuhan virus, but he calls it the Chinese virus. So, do you think it's a racist remark to call it the Chinese virus? I think I saw it just a couple days ago. I think it was after a speech made by Trump. And one of the press members just asked, why do you keep calling it Chinese virus? It has nothing to do with ethnicity or with race. So such remarks are racist. That was a question/critique. And Trump answered that, no, it's not racist. I call it this way because it comes from China. He even stressed the word China. So think about that. So do you think calling the virus itself as the Chinese virus is the racist remark? Is it something the Chinese or the entire Asians should be worried about, should be concerned with? Or let's do some empathy. How would you feel if we had an infection originating from Turkey, spreading to the rest of the world and harming the rest of the world quite heavily, and perhaps due to our mistakes, who knows? Perhaps it's because we did something bad, something we shouldn't have done, but as a result of our misbehavior, that virus came out and started to hurt people in the rest of the world. Would it be proper to call it the Turkish virus? So I also want you to think about that. And as a third up-to-date, perhaps, question, or let's call it a discussion question for now, how would you think about extending the word racism to different social groups, not related to race at all? So, there was this ban put on the elderly people in Turkey, the people over the age of 65, and they were banned from leaving their homes. And this is Turkey, and we are not very fine with the laws, with the regulations, with the advice. And many of them probably said that we've lived so far, so what? So some of them left their homes, and on the streets, some people with their cell phone cameras, put them in a very embarrassing situation. They insulted them with their words, with their behavior. It was very disrespectful, and even the public figures in Turkey, even the politicians, the officers, made statements not to disrespect the elderly in these tough days. So do you think it's a form of racism? Because yes, race, literally it's about racism, right? And it must be about the races. But we also use this word quite generously sometimes in social sciences and apply it to different social groups, not racial groups, but in this case the elderly. Sometimes even the concept is applied on such seemingly unrelated social groups. Actually, there's a better term for it. It's called ageism. So race, racism, and age, ageism. But some people argue that what we see in the streets now in Turkey is a form of racism against the elderly. So that's also a question to think about. Are the same mechanisms, the same practices, the same beliefs also relevant for non-racial groups? And that's all for today. I think we have completed about 42 minutes up to now. Let's keep this short, and I just want to sum it up what we will do from now on. This is just a YouTube lecture, and there is no interactive involvement in this lecture. But as I told you in the beginning of this video, I think I missed you guys. I think I felt lonely in this apartment. So I just wanted to say hello to you. And also I wanted to check whether you are doing okay. So please let me know how you are doing. If you need some urgent needs, if you are staying in the dormitory, if you cannot reach your friends or some other people to school, let me know. And also stay connected. You will not perhaps visit your friends, but I'm sure you are all chatting and talking on WhatsApp, on YouTube. I don't know, maybe you are even sending videos to each other, who knows. Some discussion videos for this class perhaps. But from now on we will do it better. I think next week we will have this more interactive with a different software, and we will all receive further instructions about the registration for these online classes. And let's see first how the involvement, how the participation goes on with these online classes. And after that I will rethink about our assignments, especially the attendance and participation. We need to revise them, and we will manage how to do them. And that's all for now. And for next week there will be no class. And again, you will not be responsible from Populism and Nationalism Week, as well as Nationalism and Foreign Policy, International Relations Week. I'm removing them from the syllabus for now. And that's all I'm leaving you with for now with the midterm. And I will send you another message, and I will tell you how to prepare for the midterm and how we will run the midterm. And please check your emails for that. Okay, that's all for the day. Stay safe.